everybody. Welcome for those who joined us more recently and who weren't here this morning. I'm Joanne Koob. I'm a professor here at Scalia Law as well as director of the Liberty and Law Center. And I'm delighted to be able to welcome my fellow panelists up here today. To my immediate left, or your right, I have David Bayou. David Bayou is an emeritus professor of history at the University of Alabama. His academic research covers a wide range of topics in American history, including civil rights, tax revolts, civil liberties in the New Deal period, the non-governmental provision of infrastructure, and mutual aid. His books include From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services from 1890 to 1967, and TRM Howard, Doctor, Entrepreneur, Civil Rights Pioneer, which he co-authored with Linda Royster-Beto. His most recent book, which was just published last year, is The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, the untold story of FDR's concentration camps, censorship, and mass surveillance. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin. Next to him, we have Mark Tushnet. Mark is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law, Emeritus at Harvard Law School. He specializes in constitutional law and theory, including comparative constitutional law. His research includes studies of constitutional review in the United States and around the world, and the creation of other institutions for protecting constitutional democracy. He also writes in the area of legal history, particularly constitutional history, with works on the development of civil rights law in the United States and a history of the Supreme Court in the 1930s. He graduated from Harvard College and Yale Law School and served as a clerk to Justice Thurgood Marshall. And finally, to my far left, we have Stephen Reich. Stephen Reich is a professor of history at James Madison University in Harrisonburg, Virginia. His work examines the relationship between economic and racial inequality in the post-emancipation United States. Through his work, he investigates the racial dynamics within the world of work and explores the many ways that ordinary people, black and white, organize to dismantle racial segregation and political disenfranchisement and to demand the expansion of economic rights. His current research project is a book that recounts the dramatic story of the prosperous black farm owners of Sandy Beulah, Texas, and the massacre that wiped out their community in the summer of 1910. This will be published by W.W. Norton in early 2026. So, David has actually written a paper for Voices for Liberty about the black-controlled town of Mound, Bayou as a bridgehead for free speech. It's a really fascinating story, so I'm actually just going to get us started by letting you tell us about that.
All right, well, thank you for that kind introduction, and I appreciate the indulgence of the folks from Voices for Liberty who allowed me at the last minute to put a few slides on. You may think the first slide is pretty self-indulgent, maybe it is, but it I think will help set the stage. So I'm going to have a few slides here, not much. Okay, the background on this comes out of my book, which was a biography of Dr. TRM Howard, a civil rights leader in Mississippi. Howard was greatly empowered in his activism by the fact that he lived in this all-black town, wasn't completely all-black, but black-controlled town of Mound, Bayou. This gave him a secure platform, which was relatively free from white coercion. Beginning in 1952, Howard's group, which was called the Regional Council for Negro Leadership, had all sorts of civil rights activism. Again, this is pre-Rosa Parks. In fact, he spoke in Montgomery only about a little over a week before Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, and she was in the audience. Fun fact. His group was called the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, and they would have rallies every year in Mound Bayou. They get over 10,000 people at these rallies. They had speakers like Thurgood Marshall and entertainers like Mahalia Jackson. They pushed for voting rights. They promoted boycotts against service stations that refused to provide restrooms for African Americans, successful boycott. And then in 1955, Mound Bayou was the center, the base of operations for a lot of things involved in the Emmett Till case, including an informal but quite extensive interracial investigation of the crime, trying to find witnesses and evidence and so forth. Howard was a mentor to such future civil rights figures that are much more familiar today. I'm trying to change that, but it's an uphill battle. Figures such as Medgar Evers, who worked for his insurance company as well as was a civil rights mentee, Fannie Lou Hamer, and much later, Jesse Jackson. Now, Howard's success in prominence motivated me, once I got done with him, it motivated me to look more into the history of this community, which had really enabled him, which made it possible for to do a lot of the things he did. And so this is the black-controlled town of Mound Bayou. A little bit of a picture there of its importance. Mound Bayou was founded in 1887 by these two gentlemen in the middle. They were two cousins, Isaiah T. Montgomery and Benjamin T. Green. They had been born into slavery on two interlocking plantations owned by the Davis brothers. That is, Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, and his much older and reform-minded brother, Joseph Davis. Montgomery and Green created the town on wilderness land. They had purchased, it shows you where it is, let's see, but let's look back here at some of these figures. Fannie Lou Hamer, there's Dr. Howard, and so forth. It gives you a little bit, and that's Emmett Till in the middle, who's, again, Emmett Till's mother stayed with Dr. Howard during the trial. He provided her an armed escort to the trial. So that's among the things he did. Okay, this is where Mound Bayou is located. The green star there, it's near the Mississippi River. Montgomery and Green had created the town out of land they had purchased from the railroad, basically, between on the line between Vicksburg and Memphis. The goal of the founders was to create a haven for self-government, for entrepreneurship, for free speech. I mean, it's all interlocking here in a way. In a state which was rapidly undermining those rights during the same period for African Americans. Now, in contrast to the rest of Mississippi, Mound Bayou citizens continued to vote. They continued to hold office. The mayor was black, the city council, the school board, the law enforcement, etc. By 1910, Mound Bayou had also become a center for black business. It had a bank, it had a large cotton oil mill, it had a Carnegie Library, about the only white institution in town. It had scores of other businesses. Now, this was exciting to a lot of people. It was exciting to African Americans, and some whites started to notice what was going on here. So it wasn't just this little town in Mississippi. Again, a little town that was about 1,000 people at this time, although you could say much larger because in some ways, because the surrounding area was several times larger than that. Both Booker T. Washington spoke there and President Theodore Roosevelt around 1910. And this is Washington speaking in Mound Bayou. He is speaking at the dedication of the cotton oil mill, which was one of the biggest enterprises ever attempted by African Americans at this time. Now, a little not as well known part of the story was Mound Bayou, long before Howard came along, was a center of political activism. The people there were much more likely than elsewhere, had a disproportionate role in the NAACP. For example, the mayor of the community, who was the son of Benjamin T. Green, his name was Benjamin A. Green, who was mayor for like 40 years. He was, an attorney, Harvard Law, and volunteered his services to the NAACP. It was a major hub of the state Republican Party, which at the time was controlled by the so-called a black and tan faction, African American faction of the party. Now, because of disfranchisement, which was nearly total in the state, I think it was something like under 1% of African Americans were qualified to vote by the 1940s. It was very low. So they can't compete in elections. A black controlled party, forget it. But that doesn't mean they'd given up on activism. The party goes on record pushing for civil rights measures, such as laws against lynching. Especially helpful in this regard were the services provided by Mary Booz. Mary Booz was a daughter of the town's founder, Isaiah T. Montgomery. Because of the prominence of the town and her activism in the local Republican Party, Mary Booz was appointed to the Republican National Committee. First black woman on the committee, served in that capacity till 1952. So she was from the 1924 to 52. She used that position to lobby on civil rights issues, including anti-lynching laws, including racist kind of appointments and that kind of thing, to both members of Congress and Republican presidents, and had some effectiveness in that position. So I think I'll stop there. I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on the paper and what I'm talking about. Just to sort of briefly say the motivation, I'm going backward in time here, looking at the origins of this community. And a lot of people keep pushing me to talk about the 1950s because that seems much more exciting, and I'll be happy to talk about that. But again, the whole purpose of the paper was to sort of go back and look at how this community was created and how it provided a kind of platform for people like T.R.M. Howard to go out there and do all kinds of pretty risky things, because he was always able to return to Mound Bayou. It's not perfect by any means, but it gives some security. Thank you.
Thank you. Mark, I'm going to let you comment on everything that you read and that David just told us about.
Okay, well, thank you. So my comments are operate at the sort of intersection of political theory and the sociology and history of political movements. And I'm focusing on something that David didn't talk about in his presentation here, but the Bridgehead for Free Speech part of his project. So the political theory part of this is this. Rights, as we generally understand them, are, for many, at least in part, and for some entirely, derived from ideas about individual autonomy and self-actualization. So we've already heard about that in the context of both free speech and freedom of religion, the latter in connection with rights of conscience. My favorite formulation actually comes from the German Basic Law, which refers to the free development of personality as a basic right. I refer to in my own work as a general right to liberty. It's not the best, it's an awkward phrase, but it captures the idea. That is, when one exercises one of these rights, one is deploying something sort of intrinsically individual, one is self-actualizing. You have yourself that you are actualizing through your exercise of the rights. Now, as I mentioned, there are other components of individual rights. Free expression is connected to the promotion of democracy, for example. Freedom of religion is connected to things like an affiliation with a historical tradition, or to use a term that's, I'm old, so I'm familiar with it, but probably outdated, brotherhood in Christ. But the focus on the individual autonomy components of these rights. Now, I think the point I take from the story that David tells is that even with an individual self-actualization understanding of rights, those rights are helped, I don't know if there's a better term, by the existence of social supports for them. This is not social controls in the way that we heard about in the last session, but simply social supports for them so that they're not entirely individual. And these supports are in part financial, and so an important part of the story of civil rights in the South, the role of independent professionals, independent black professionals, as participants in the civil rights movements, doctors, David mentioned, dentists, barbers, real estate agents, people who are not dependent upon the white community for their financial well-being were able to participate in oppositionist movements without being worried about financial consequences. Incidentally, that contrasts with some of the school litigation in which teachers were involved, and they were subject to and were fired for participating in anti-segregation efforts. But in addition to the financial things, I want to stress there's a sort of validation that comes from seeing that what you are doing, what you feel to be your self-actualization, actually has some social support. Basically, it's sort of, I'm not crazy. There are others who think like this. And that is actually relevant to the general idea of free expression. That is, I have these ideas. It helps to know that other people have those ideas, and I can't know that unless they're able to express themselves too. So one component of this is the role of black churches as spiritual locations, not merely as financial places. And something that I thought about actually, both in my first writing on rights and then much more recently, the element of mass demonstrations that makes them just fun to do. My first piece on this was inspired in part by the March on the Pentagon in 1968 or whenever it was, which was, my wife's here, we were there. It was, it was an experience to see that there were folks like that. And then I actually think, I think of most of the unindicted January 6th people probably got a lot of oomph out of being there. Not just that they were supporting Donald Trump, fine, but they were they saw themselves as part of a movement, which they wouldn't have been able to see had they not had the freedom to engage in that. Now, I'll stop here. There are some limits on this that I can mention later, but I think I'll just stop because I think my time's up.
Thank you, Mark, and I'll probably circle back and we can dig into those limits a little later. But now I'd like to provide Steve with the opportunity to provide his thoughts on what we've discussed so far.
Sure, thank you, Joanne, and thank you to Voices of Liberty for the invitation to join you all today. And I had the pleasure of being in the Symposium in June and being a commentator on David's on the first draft, and now I get to see the second draft and see the tremendous improvements that the paper, not that it wasn't good the first time, but I'm an historian. I'm a historian of the Jim Crow period, and it's unusual to, I wouldn't come to this thinking of Mound Bayou as a free speech space. I mean, that's not the approach I would take, but David calls it a free speech safe space in the first sentence of the paper, and it got me to thinking a lot of the deep implications of what that meant and what Mound Bayou actually was and why it matters. As I read the paper, I see Mound Bayou as a kind of a political space, a very important political space. But I keep coming back to asking myself, why did such a place matter? How could it have existed in a very hostile environment. And one of the things that I sort of keep asking myself is, what did Mound Bayou provide to African Americans that they could not have found as a sharecropper in the Delta or as a longshoreman in Hattiesburg or what have you. And it got me also to thinking that Mound Bayou was in itself something of a place of exodus, where people go to. And exodus is a sort of a important political term in the African American political imagination. The time in which Mound Bayou was settled, there was the Exoduster movement, which African Americans leaving very hostile environments in Mississippi, in Louisiana, in East Texas, going and creating all black towns in places like Oklahoma and Kansas. But then there's this Mound Bayou experiment, which stays in the lion's den, if you will, in the heart of the most hostile place in the Jim Crow South. But you think of it as this sort of political space. And I think this is what David could maybe emphasize more, the sort of the personal liberty or political liberties that Mound Bayou offers. It's a place for community life to flourish without interference. It's a place for home rule. It's a place of safe distance. It's a place of safety. There's a lot of interesting, we can get to this maybe later in the discussion, interesting things about how low the crime rate is in Mound Bayou, which is extraordinary because if you look at the Southern press during the Jim Crow period, it is full, you cannot read an issue without reading about so-called black crime. But there is no crime in Mound Bayou, which then raises the whole point about the sort of political circumstances and the criminalization of black activity that doesn't get criminalized in Mound Bayou. There's a great quote he has in the paper where some visitor says, "I love it as a place where I can just shout and scream and no one will bother me." I'm misquoting what the line is, but that is very important. It's self-regulating, it's self-sustaining, it keeps the outside world at bay. It's a community of care, it's a non-threatening space. It creates its own institutions, its own newspaper, its own lodges, its own churches, its own schools, where people can debate, where they can argue, where they can incubate ideas, where talent can be found, where they can manage resources and budgets, and then find leaders. David has a lot of stuff in here about the Republican Party and the African Americans that form in that Republican Party. I see that as the least interesting part of this and sort of the least important, because I think the more interesting political parts comes from those activities that are outside of the electoral major political party infrastructure. That lays the groundwork for later participation when the political arena and infrastructure changes to allow more meaningful participation. But I'll just, one sort of last question here. When you're thinking of politics, though, does the politics that happens in Mound Bayou matter? Or is it just a space in and of itself, separated from the rest of the world and hostile? Does it actually pose a threat, a redistributive threat to those who actually control the levers of power in Mississippi? I'm not sure I know what the answer to that is, but certainly at one point in the 50s and 60s, it does become a place where these activists can go to act, to take out their actions in hostile territory, but it's a safe organizing place for them to start from. But I have other things to say, and I think Joanne's got more questions. We can go from there.
Sounds great, thank
Okay.
you. I'm actually, though, going to pick up on a strand that Steve was just talking about this. Mound Bayou as sort of a safe space. And so, the paper starts as Mound Bayou as a bridgehead for free speech. And so when we're looking at that, is it an internal thing where the speech and the rights and everything we're seeing that Mound Bayou is able to achieve is really within self-contained, or how much of that, how much does Mound Bayou doing that and having this internal system and community where rights are protected and valued, how much of that sort of creeps outward and makes progress outside of the town?
Yeah, this is a part of the story that I think some critics of Mound Bayou have gotten wrong. Mound Bayou is very interconnected with what's going on in the rest of Mississippi. And I could look, there are earlier rallies that were that number, but Howard's rallies, 10,000 people, that's 10 times the population of Mound Bayou, would come, and these are all African Americans. This is before whites were involved, really volunteering. I mean, you might have one or two whites, but it was really overwhelmingly an African American movement, in contrast perhaps to what came in the 60s, where you have much more white participation. And they were coming to this town mostly from other parts of Mississippi where they could not vote, they could not hold office, they had to be off the street, curfews, there's no curfew like that in Mound Bayou, and they're there in this environment. So I think and Mound Bayouans were seen as kind of psychologically different by a lot of black commentators who point out they've got this kind of view that they're a free people, in the United States, and they've got this sort of self-confidence. So I think that has a spillover effect. In fact, I know it does, where people would see these examples and they'd go back, and you have a rich life there of mutual aid. One of the largest organizations in Mound Bayou is Howard's first employer, the Knights and Daughters of Tabor. And Tabor was a fraternal society, a mutual aid organization, and they built a hospital in the 1940s. They raised the money during the Great Depression. It was considered something of a state-of-the-art hospital at the time. It was paid for without any government money, and so forth. And they built this hospital, and they hired Howard as a chief surgeon. Now, this organization, at their annual meeting when they elected a new leader, more people voted on the leadership elections of this particular organization in Mound Bayou than all of the African Americans in the entire state of Mississippi. So it's also a school for self-government, for parliamentary procedure, for organization, and so forth. And that's not just true in Mound Bayou. I think these fraternal societies and other organizations, churches as well, were providing that kind of organizational knowledge. And so in many ways, it was a much more meaningful election than anything held in Mound Bayou or anything held nationally for most African Americans in Mississippi at the time to vote for who was going to be the head of the Knights and Daughters of Tabor, which maintained this hospital. They had like 50,000 members in the state of Mississippi. That's not anything too insignificant. And you get 30 days of hospital care for like $8 a year. So it was an interesting experiment in kind of cooperative medical care as well.
And actually, I think that brings us back to what Mark was raising when he gave his initial comments, that for a lot of people, the exercise of their individual rights really depends on this. It needs a system of social support backing it up, in what we see from Mound Bayou and happening in Mound Bayou. Mark, though, what do you think the scope of that argument is? How much does this social support is required for people to exercise their rights?
Yeah, so I think sort of as a practical matter, quite a lot. That is, when I try to think about this kind of problem, I want to sort of try to isolate the pure self-actualization dimension of rights from other aspects like rights being exercised in the service of democracy and so on, trying to change the system and the like. That latter domain is enormous. And that sort of thing, since you're trying to mobilize politically, you have to have, you're trying to get other people to go along. That's the whole point of it. And incidentally, theoretically, I think it then does bring in the questions of social regulation that were mooted in the prior panel. When you focus on the pure self-actualization part, it's not that much actually, but it's really quite interesting as a matter of sort of political theory. So just the two examples I have of limitations. In an early study of the rise of the nuns that we talked about in the last session, the sociologist Robert Bellah interviewed a woman named Sheila and asked her what her religion was, and she said her religion was Sheilaism. That was, pure self-actualization. Now I have some questions about that. My view is that there's a fancy sort of no private language argument that says she can't really think of herself as she can't have ideas about spirituality, which he expresses as Sheilaism, without there being a world in which people are talking about spirituality all along. So my other example is about as close to a pure example as I can give. One of the great conceptual cases in the German free development of personality is about this guy who wants to, I use the phrase from the Tom Lehrer song, just feed the pigeons in the park. The Tom Lehrer song is poisoning the pigeons in the park. This guy just wants to feed the pigeons in the park. And the city says, you can't feed pigeons in the park because they're environmentally harmful. So then you have to, and he said, well, but you're impairing my right to free development of personality. Then you have to sort of think about why it is that he wants to feed the pigeons in the park. And the best answer is this guy is a social isolate, and the only way he gets pleasure in life is out of feeding in the park. Nobody talks to him. He lives in an apartment all the time. He's a grumpy guy, but the pigeons in the park give him pleasure. So that's a pure self-actualization case. And then you have to think about the social issue about, the German court said, of course, the city can regulate for environmental reasons. What I find interesting is the German theorists don't take the case seriously. I think it is a really interesting theoretical case. Sorry, but it's minor. I want to say, this area is, I think, really interesting as a matter of theory. As a matter of practice, the whole swoop of free exercise, the social supports are financial, we need to mobilize other people to get what we want to get done, and so on.
Just briefly, it's interesting about religion, and of course, the churches were very important, Mound Bayou. Having said that, I think the role of religion in some ways has been overrated in civil rights history. Dr. Howard, he was a Seventh-day Adventist, kind of. He sort of drifted from the church. He didn't have any connection with any church in Mound Bayou to speak of, but different ones. He cultivated that. But if you look at the Regional Council of Negro Leadership, in contrast to King's group, the Montgomery Improvement Association, and later the SCLC, the clergy is very minimal representation by comparison. Howard's group tend to be entrepreneurs, small scale people. They are professionals, farmers, fraternal society leaders, Masons, Elks, Knights and Daughters of Tabor, etc. So it's interesting, and one explanation I've heard or I've thought of for that, why is that, is that the churches are comparatively weak in the Mississippi Delta. You've got these black churches that have itinerant preachers. They got to get permission from plantation owners to go, and preach. They're dependent on white patronage very often. Where King has got a situation, Montgomery, you've got the black middle class that can maintain these nice churches, and they provide a degree of independence. Who has that in the Mississippi Delta? It tends to be the black business class. Charles Evers told me, he says, they couldn't do anything against me. I didn't depend on him for anything. He was always into these sometimes quite dodgy businesses, but that's what he was. He was a businessman. And Medgar Evers gets his start selling insurance, apparently quite a good insurance salesman for Dr. Howard. That was what thought his career was going to be because he was working for Dr. Howard. So it's an interesting Religion, I wouldn't underrate at all. I think it's tremendously important, but it's interesting how that is our stereotype of civil rights, and it doesn't really fit in the same way in the Mississippi Delta.
So Mound Bayou is clearly an interesting case that I think can be a case study in looking at how do and under what conditions do the disenfranchised feel empowered to engage in politics, to mobilize for change, to create social, community, political solidarity. Steve, are you able to comment on that?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think this has been said in one way or another by some of the comments, but let me try to bring a couple of things together. I mean, what Mound Bayou seems to suggest, and maybe I would push back just a little bit on the church thing, but again, I don't know the ins and outs of the details of the Mississippi Delta, but some of these, what Mound Bayou seems to be able to create are community institutions in which people can participate. And particularly if you're thinking about like the Masons, there's a women's auxiliary, and the women can play a very important, powerful role there. Same within the churches. In these kinds of black institutions that might look from the outside to be small and insignificant, can actually be incubators of very important organizational talent, and particularly are spaces in which women can be brought into the political conversation. And I think that when you look at where some of the women in the civil rights movement come from, they come out of these kinds of spaces, and so I think that and so in your paper, I think it's Mary Booz who's the one woman who plays a sort of an outsized role, but I'm really curious to know what other black women are doing in Mound Bayou and how they are contributing to its sense of its own, of its identity. I also think a place for a free press. So there was a newspaper in Mound Bayou. Now we don't know, I mean, David tells me that no copies of that newspaper have survived, but he may know where some exist. They may be in an attic somewhere. He can maybe talk a little bit about that. But that would be great to be able to find something like that, because that can give, and that would also give you the sense of how, I mean, I would be surprised if the people who were prominent within Mound Bayou didn't have to be very careful about some kind of self-censorship, being very careful about what they said, to not bring undue attention onto what's happening there. And so African Americans organize all the time throughout the Jim Crow period. They are in spaces of all different manner and form. Whites don't really have access to what goes on in those spaces, which makes them both useful for their own organizing, but also imperiled because whites, when they get nervous, can say, what are they doing in those meetings that we don't understand what's going on? And Mound Bayou, in a way, seems like that kind of a space that's much larger. And so we can get this, but one of my questions is why does Mound Bayou survive not being attacked? When a place like Tulsa, when hundreds of small black sharecropping communities and landowning communities across the South got attacked, Rosewoods blown. What is it that Mound Bayou had that preserved it from being under assault?
Yeah, I actually was curious about that as well, so we'd love to
Yeah,
hear.
some of that is sheer luck. I think there were times when that could have all been overturned, but it's sort of the timing. It comes at the time of the Mississippi Disfranchisement Constitution. In fact, Isaiah Montgomery, he doesn't endorse it, but he kind of goes along with it. Frederick Douglass said he was like a general who realized he could no longer defend his post and decided to withdraw. And people blamed him for that. I think he just figured it wasn't worth the fight. It wasn't, in the 1890s, he wasn't going to win. So Mound Bayou was sort of set aside, and a lot of whites, they had an ambivalent view towards it, but a lot of them would say, look, they like segregation. They're doing just great. They got segregation. Let them do their thing. They're off on their own. I mean, there is this interaction, but it is there are very few white people in that immediate community, so they can kind of make that argument. Now, when Howard comes along, boy, they're like, whites are going, what the heck's going on with this town that we used to praise? But so whites have this kind of strange view. I think a lot of it's that they're off on their own. That has something to do with it. The timing of how it's formed, and diplomacy. As I said, the mayor there for 40 years is a Harvard. People say, why did he stay there, right? He's a Harvard law graduate. He's got this distinguished record in the military during World War I. But he's Mayor Green, and he's a very good diplomat. And Howard does this too. He kind of talks out of both sides of his mouth. Said, well, you're worried about segregation and you're worried about friction. Well, we're here doing our own thing. You don't have to worry about us. But then there's a subversive side of that. Back to the role of women. 2/3 of the members, we call them fraternal societies, and that's what they called themselves, as in fraternity. But 2/3 of the members of the Knights and Daughters of Tabor were women. And these are mainly, I guess they're comparatively more middle class, but you're talking about primarily, farm tenants, sharecroppers, that kind of thing. I mean, I've gone through trying to, do a profile. So these are generally very poor people, in one of the poorest areas for African Americans there is. So 2/3 of there are women, and they exercise very much a leadership role in the fraternal society. It's kind of they got separate lodges. They call their lodges tabernacles, I think, and the men call theirs temples, and So there's sort of that kind of thing going on there, but they're very assertive. Now, on religion, there is an interconnection. Like for Knights and Daughters of Tabor, as in the mountain of Galilee, I guess, where Christ made the ascension. I might have gotten that wrong. But it was a Christian organization, and they would make deals with churches. Give over 1 day a year your church to our society. We'll go there, and we'll promote our good work to your church. So they had this interlocking relationship. I'm not sure if that's answering your questions. Why weren't they destroyed? I think some of it's luck, and some of it's just circumstance. Some of it is whites are sort of flattered by this. It confirms their worldview, and then when challenged, and a lot of the challenge is kind of a little bit below the radar, at least before Howard comes along, but it's there. But whites are sort of willing to kind of look the other way to maybe some extent, and they just sort of ignore what's going on there. They're doing their thing, they're not monitoring that much what's going on there, really. It's kind of neglect, benign neglect.
David, you actually state in your paper that Mound Bayou citizens thought of themselves as a saving remnant. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, they didn't necessarily use that term. In fact, I think you were bringing up Isaiah, the idea of the saving remnant from the Old Testament. After the destruction of the kingdom of Israel and Judea, there's the great exile, and the Jews got to kind of sort of keep the faith in their tradition. So there's kind of this idea of the remnant, and what is the remnant? Well, what's left over. But the remnant also, there's a more activist interpretation of what the remnant is as well. An example, keeping the flame burning, in this case of liberty, of individual rights. And they really, I think, to some extent, see themselves that way, as a kind of remnant, of holding up these traditions of equal rights when there are assault everywhere else, and providing an example.
And then I want to tie this back to something that came up at the last panel, which was about freedom of speech as an individual liberty and important to sort of self-actualization. And we've been talking a lot about how really in Mound Bayou we see people working together as exercising their rights. So Mark, given that this is something you've thought a lot about, do you think that arguing for certain of these rights as individual in nature is undermined by their sort of the way that they're socially enacted in reality, or how do those fit together?
So for the large swath that is the major domain of these rights, I think what happens is to use terms from the prior session, the necessary infiltration of the social into the domain of individual rights, and which means that for me that you can't conceive of these in this domain, this very large domain. You can't conceive of the rights as purely individual in nature. They necessarily have, again, in this domain, a communal dimension to them, which leads to, all sorts of doctrinal complexities and institutional concerns that are the sort of meat and potatoes of the free expression course that I used to teach. That another way of putting it is that it would be, you can, I think, imagine call it purely libertarian law of free expression, but that would that law would, I think, I want to say necessarily have no connection to a law of free expression in the real world of politics.
Yeah, there is a. I mean, I'm giving a very positive portrait, but there are. The self-government has its more oppressive examples. One example I came across is that they would have these big town meetings, and a lot of the important issues were debated at these. And at one of them, they said, "Well, we're going to set up a committee. It's going to go to each house, and it's going to see, are the couples, are they legally married? And if they're not, we're giving a certain amount of time to remedy that, or they're going to have to leave the community." Now, I don't know how effectively that was enforced, but there is a kind of, and what's motivating that? Well, a lot of it is they see their community as representing this kind of, I don't know, Victorian morality. This, we're these self-reliant, moral people. All these stereotypes about us are wrong, and so forth. And so, it's kind of like, we're Rousseauian kind of localism that can have its oppressive side to it as well. And that would be one example of it. So it's not a libertarian, freewheeling, completely, whatever you want to do. It's like a small town, right? In a lot of ways, that's what small towns are like. Been watching this show lately, Peyton Place, a lot of fun. But that's, you run into each other all the time. People are monitoring each other. There's surveillance. It's just the nature of the beast to some extent.
Sort of like an HOA association.
Yeah, I guess so.
Steve, what do you think this story of Mound Bayou tells us about how the disenfranchised exercise their political rights?
Well, I think of what we've been saying is that spaces for organization matter. So to exercise political rights in a place like Mound Bayou, or any place like the Jim Crows, if you are an individual sharecropper in the Jim Crow South or a tenant farmer somewhere, your ability to express yourself politically was practically zero. There's no space for doing that. Any comment you might make would threaten violence on you or your family. You'd be isolated, you would be alone, you would not do it. So to exercise political rights takes organization, it takes coordination, it takes some kind of coherent platform or debating of ideas about what matters. It is this exchange of sharing about what our priorities are as a people, defining yourself as a people, as political actors, as people who share a common problem that needs to be resolved. Yeah, we may have differences, but our understanding of ourselves as Black or as economically oppressed or as lacking in opportunity, any way in which people are going to define that, they need to find other like-minded people who can validate what they are feeling and then come up with an understanding about how do we coordinate and collaborate and organize to solve that problem. And you can't do that on a plantation controlled by an overbearing landlord with an army of overseers. Very, very difficult. But in a place like Mound Bayou, there's some possibilities there. Yes, there's moral policing, and that moral policing, as David suggested, may have a lot to do with the outside world casting judgment on who and what they are and how they comport themselves. But that moral policing may have been something that, okay, we're going to do that because what mostly matters is being able to run our business or to accumulate wealth or to get the vote, things like that. So, yeah.
Thank you. I want to give the audience an opportunity to ask questions. I see a gentleman right here.
You briefly mentioned the finances as being fairly a poor community, but could you compare it to the surrounding communities as far as their financial or agricultural productivity? It seems that living in isolation has its advantages and disadvantages. Primary disadvantage being they'd have to interact, at least in the periphery, with the surrounding Jim Crow communities.
Oh, there's a lot of interaction. I mean, Howard is a good example. He's buying tractors, he's got trade relationships with all sorts of whites, including some that end up in the citizens' councils that do provide him some protection when the pressure is exerted on him in a major way before and after the Emmett Till case. So I wouldn't say people they're interacting economically with the surrounding communities. Now, it's a very interesting question as to how it compares economically in terms of standard of living with surrounding communities. This is Bolivar County at the time. Mound Bayou's in that, and I think it's something like 80%. It's really high African American.
Yeah.
So it's surrounded, by. I would suspect it's more prosperous because they do have much more of a professional class there, a middle class, teachers. If you're in Bolivar County and you want to go to any sort of high school, Mound Bayou is it. So it really is kind of, I would be willing to bet that they're on balance doing better economically than people in the surrounding communities because those are rural communities, right? And a lot of very small towns in Mississippi. It's not a very urban state, at least the Mississippi Delta isn't at all. So I haven't done a study like that, but that's what I would bet would be the case. But they're interconnected with what's going on. in terms of trade relationships and economic relationships.
And how this insular society could release the potential for the people participating in it.
I think it's, they're leading by example in a lot of ways. And it's a spillover effect two ways. You have a lot of people coming there to observe the community or by accident observe it. And then they're going into other communities. And again, I didn't talk to many around, but there are interviews of people who lived in Mount Bayou in the 30s and said, we go in a store and we would, we want something from the store. We were clear about what we wanted. And they would respond, oh, you're one of those Mound Bayou such and such. We know about them. I mean, and this was often said that they got a sense of entitlement, they're pushy, they think they're as good as anybody else. And, they're interacting all the time, going to Cleveland and Clarksdale and these nearby communities, to shop and go to movie theaters and that kind of thing. So they're not just sort of staying there. Yeah.
I see Debbie in the front row has a question.
I'm curious how they dealt with dissent within Mound Bayou
Dissent
and
what?
dissent.
Mhm.
And if somebody wanted to challenge these community leaders that were, acting as morality police and other things, how was challenge received? How did dissent work? Did it lead to improvements in the community, or were those people pushed out of the community?
Yeah, well, Mayor Green's there for many years, and they have elections every year, but he wins all of them overwhelmingly against Mary Booth's husband, interestingly enough, who's not well liked in the community. And there's a story of what happens to him, which is not pretty. But this is why the miniseries could be really good. But he runs against Mayor Green all the time. He's there, he loses every time. So there's a little bit of a feeling of oligarchy. Now, when Howard, during the Till case, really, Howard is giving these speeches where he's saying, in Mount Bayou, reported in the press, Senator Bilbo was this old racist senator who died a few years before, notorious racist, said, Senator Bilbo sent a message to the current governor of Mississippi from hell. And the governor says, well, and Bilbo's message is, why don't you ease up and stop mistreating black people? And the governor says, well, why did you say that, Senator Bilbo, you of all people? He said, because we got a Negro fireman down here who's keeping it mighty hot for us. He would give speeches like that. They were reported in the press, and nothing happened to them. Now, a lot of it is they got a lot of guns there. They're heavily armed. Howard has a Thompson submachine gun. And the whites coming close, they stand out, because there's not a lot of whites going to these rallies where you get 10,000 people. Now, you talk about dissent. Mount Bayou's town, when Mayor Green was in the hospital, the assistant mayor announced that said, we're not going to allow any more of these subversive meetings by Howard and his people in our town. It's giving our town a bad name. So he failed in that, because I think Green asserted himself, and Green was no friend of Howard, but he sort of he backed off on that. So there was some tension. There were people there that did not like the attention that Howard was bringing to the community, and were worried about it and wanted to push back on it. So it's not all, they're not all 100%, behind what, the radical approach he's taking.
Well, with that was perfect timing. I just got the 1 minute warning. And so I will conclude this by just thanking our author and our panelists for their insightful comments. So thank you all.
Thank you.